So this is a quick introduction to HyperVoxels. I'm using Lightwave 11.6.3, but it's exactly the same in 2015 if that's the version you are using. I'm going to start by going to the Effects Tools tab and come down and add some particles. Particle emitter. Default name is emitter. We've got two types of emitters, the HV or hypervoxel emitter and the partigon emitter. The only difference between these is that the partigon emitter, you can see the points, they get rendered. The HV emitter, the points are not rendered, they are replaced by hypervoxels, so that's the one that we will be using here. And you can see it comes up with the default generator, 1 meter cubed. The birth rate is 100 particles per second. You can do different parameters there. Particle limit of 1,000, depending on how many particles you need on the screen, but after you get to 1,000 particles, they will start disappearing. The oldest ones will go first. You can see as I drag the timeline across here, particles are generated within that box. And doesn't look that interesting yet. I'm going to turn my end time up to 240 frames. And I'm going to drop the box size down a little bit smaller because I've reduced the screen for recording here. So I'm going to go 0.5 meter. But you'll see the same thing is happening. We've got particles being generated inside that area. The next tab has things where you can adjust the weight and the resistance of the particles if you're going to throw wind at them. It also has the lifetime. So particles have a time span set right now to 60 frames. I'm going to bump that up to 100. Just so they last a little bit longer here. And I'm going to take my generator and keyframe it over the time here so we can see what happens to these particles. So you can see there, and they get sort of left behind as a trail. I'll just bump this up in the middle there, so you can see the particles get left behind as a trail. And the lifetime will vary how long that trail is. So at 50 you can see it's a very short trail. If you put this up to 150, you'd have a very long trail. So that's the parameter that controls how long the trail is. So there are other tabs here that allow you just the velocity of the emitters as they're being emitted. There's an explosion one here that as you put it up, it pushes the particles outwards from the center to spread the particles out a little bit more. If you want a bigger trail, you might want to do that. I'm going to put it back down to just to have a small trail going here. And the other tabs, we've got things like gravity. So if you want to have the gravity pulling down on the trail, there we go. The particles are now falling due to gravity. It's pretty serious gravity happening. You can fake that any way you want. Blurring and parenting and stuff like that. There's also rotation and interaction, saving the motion files. Tabs. The other interesting one that's useful here, you'll see it back here at frame 0. There's only a few particles haven't started yet. You can actually start the start frame at an earlier time to get so the particles are built up at the start of the scene if you need to do that. Otherwise, you might have to move in and render from frame 50 or 60 to get a good trail of particles going on here. That's just if you. So you go back here to 1 and we can fix that start frame at -50, and you see now there's already quite a few particles built up at that time, and they get left behind. So just turn that off. So the particles are not that interesting. What we're going to do next is replace them with hypervoxels. So down here, this tab, the HyperVoxel tab, This brings this window up. We've got the emitter, which is grayed out. That's this thing, the default name. Double click on that to activate it, or you can click on it and select activate. And I'm just going to bring this along so we have an interesting trail here. And to see these things, I have to render or use the VPR. So there we are. So there are 3 different types of HyperVoxels. This is the surface HyperVoxels, which are good for fluids and blobby things like that. There are also volume, which are the cloudy things, which is good for smoke trails and steam emissions. And sprite, which is a volume one that's been sliced. This is much faster rendering than the volume, and you can see here in the shading you can adjust the number of slices, 1, 3, 5, 7, so it gets a little bit thicker. It'll render much quicker than the volume, but the look just isn't quite as good. So I'm going to be using the volume. We've got under the geometry, we can adjust the particle size, so we can make the particles larger and smaller. And we can adjust, have variations in the size of the particles, so some big ones and some small ones if you want to. Stretch them, blending and things like that in that tab. In the shading, we can adjust the color and the quality and illumination. And the hypertexture, we can adjust the actual texture itself and the texture amplitude. The default is crumple, but there's some interesting things that can be done with the other parameters. Turbulence is pretty good, get a little bit more fuzzy details going on there. Same with the FBM, it's got more detail going on. Puffy clouds, yeah, now you know what this is for. I'm going to go back to the crumple just to have something there, so we can scale and so forth within the texture as well. So back in the shading, we want to change the color of this over time. So in the basic tab here, we can adjust the color using the T button here, and we'll use a gradient. As an interesting use of a gradient, we'll start with something like a bright yellow and then change it to red, and then later on change it to dark gray or black or something like that. Yeah. So you can see that this has just got the colors all mixed up with the previous layer. The input parameter, if we change that to the relative particle age, now we've got their gradient going from early to late. So it starts with the yellow, goes through red to the dark, and you can adjust the sort of spacing between these with this. What this gradient represents, the start is the birth of the particle, end is the death of the particle, and we've got them set to 150 frames right now. So that's frame 150. It goes to the dark red there. So you can adjust the color however you want through the gradient with the particle age. The other interesting use of gradients here is in the geometry. You can adjust the particle size. So we can start out, again, we'll use a gradient with the parameter, there's a particle age, and we'll start out maybe a little bit smaller. We can start at 50%, and then at the end we grow to 200. So like start small and get big is a option. That smoke coming out of a steam engine or something like that, you'd want to have something like that that starts small and then spreads out a little bit more. The other interesting one here is this dissolve. So the strange behavior when these particles are going along here, as they age and reach their expiration date, they disappear. They just sort of pop out of view, which kind of looks weird, and I don't like them doing that. So what I usually do is use this dissolve. So the dissolve you see as 0, it is solid, and as it goes up to 100%, it fades to nothing. So again, using the T button, we can put a gradient on that using, once again, the relative particle age. So we start at this time 0, and we move up to 100% at the end. Oops, 100. So instead of having it gradually fade away, I'll put another one in the middle just to hold it at the 0 point. So it'll stay solid from there to there, and then it'll fade. So we've got solid from beginning to, say, 60% through, and then it fades out. So we're just fading those last ones as they're, instead of letting them pop out, they're fading out, which is just looks a little bit neater. That pretty much covers that. One other thing that I know sometimes happens, this window, if you close it, where do you find it again? If you select the emitter as an object and look at the properties, or P for properties, here in the geometry, there's the effects emitter, and you can double click on that to open up that window again. And then the HyperVoxel window doesn't have an interface here. You have to actually open the HyperVoxel window over there to get that one back to play with your colors and your shapes. Just a word of warning before I leave you, don't let these things fill the screen. Your render time will go through the roof if you do that. Just the voice of experience here. Keep them relatively small on the screen, and you shouldn't have any problem with reasonable render times. Good luck with it. I hope this has helped.